Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you least expect. On a quiet Sunday morning at Desert Valley Shooting Range, a group of rowdy bikers were about to learn this lesson the hard way when they crossed paths with Sarah Connor, a petite intensive care nurse with 20 years of competitive shooting experience and multiple combat medicine deployments under her belt. They had no idea their attempt at intimidation would lead to the most humbling experience of their lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona desert as Sarah Connor pulled her white Honda Civic into the parking lot of Desert Valley Shooting Range. It was 6:15 a.m. on a crisp February morning, and the scent of creosote and desert sage filled the air. At 45 years old, Sarah's delicate features and small frame often led people to underestimate her, but the quiet confidence in her hazel eyes told a different story. 20 years as an ICU nurse had taught her how to remain calm in the most intense situations, while her lifelong passion for competitive shooting had honed her into one of the most skilled markswomen in the state. Though few of her hospital colleagues knew it, Sarah held multiple state championships in practical shooting competitions and had served 3 tours as a civilian combat nurse trainer in Afghanistan, teaching medical personnel how to operate effectively in high-stress combat situations. As she stepped out of her car, Sarah went through her usual pre-range routine. She checked her range bag methodically, her customized Glock 34 competition pistol, carefully maintained and modified over years of competition, spare magazines, eye and ear protection, and her basic trauma kit. Old habits from her deployment days meant she never went anywhere without medical supplies, even for a simple morning at the range. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore her favorite range outfit, comfortable tactical pants, a moisture-wicking polo shirt with her Range Club's logo, and well-broken-in shooting boots. The only visible sign of her medical background was a small silver caduceus pendant that caught the early morning light as she moved. The range was nearly empty at this hour, exactly how Sarah preferred it. The weekend crowds wouldn't arrive for several hours, giving her precious time to practice for the upcoming regional championships. 2 other cars sat in the gravel parking lot. She recognized the ancient Toyota pickup belonging to Bob Martinez, the 70-year-old range safety officer, who had become something of a mentor to her over the years. The other vehicle, a pristine red Jeep Wrangler, belonged to Emma Chen, a promising young shooter Sarah had taken under her wing. At just 19, Emma reminded Sarah of herself at that age, determined, focused, and absolutely fearless when it came to learning new shooting disciplines. The girl had natural talent, and Sarah enjoyed helping her develop it. Taking a deep breath of the cool morning air, Sarah smiled as a family of quail scurried across the parking lot, their top-knots bobbing as they disappeared into a cluster of saguaro cacti. The familiar crack of distant gunfire echoed from the rifle range, where Bob was probably already running through his morning routine. After 3 decades as a Marine Corps marksmanship instructor, the old range officer still maintained the discipline of daily practice. As Sarah started toward the range office to sign in, she noticed fresh oil stains on the gravel, motorcycle tracks that hadn't been there the day before. Her situational awareness, honed through years of operating in combat zones, noted this detail automatically. The sound of multiple motorcycle engines rumbling in the distance confirmed her observation. While motorcyclists weren't uncommon at the range, something about these approaching bikes set off warning signals in her mind. Sarah had seen enough trouble during her deployments to recognize its sound, and these engines carried the unmistakable rhythm of trouble heading her way. Still, she maintained her calm demeanor as she continued toward the range office. Whatever was coming, she had handled worse situations in far more dangerous places than a local shooting range on a quiet Sunday morning. Little did she know that this peaceful morning practice session was about to turn into something very different, calling upon every bit of her medical training, shooting expertise, and combat zone experience. The thundering motorcycles growing louder in the distance were about to shatter the desert calm, and Sarah Connor was about to become the last person a group of overconfident bikers should have chosen to intimidate. Sarah's mind drifted to her morning routine at Phoenix General's intensive care unit as she approached the range office. The controlled chaos of the ICU had taught her to stay calm under pressure, a skill that had served her well both in combat zones and on the shooting range. Just yesterday, she had stabilized 3 trauma patients from a major car accident. her steady hands never wavering despite the intensity of the situation. The familiar smell of gun oil and coffee greeted her as she stepped into the office. Bob Martinez looked up from his morning paperwork, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Morning, Sarah. Those bikes heading our way sound like trouble." His voice carried the gruff authority of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining order on military ranges. "Morning, Bob. Heard them too." Sarah signed the range log with practiced efficiency. "Emma already set up on Bay 3? "Yeah. Kid's been here since sunrise. Reminds me of you when you first started shooting here." Bob's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Though I recall you showing up even earlier." Sarah chuckled, remembering those early days. She had discovered competitive shooting shortly after her first deployment as a civilian combat nurse. The precision and discipline of the sport had helped her process the trauma she'd witnessed in war zones, giving her a sense of control when everything else felt chaotic. Over the years, it had evolved from therapy into passion, and finally into mastery. Through the office window, she could see Emma on Bay 3, carefully working through her dry-fire drills. The young woman's form was improving rapidly, her movements becoming more fluid and confident with each practice session. Sarah had first noticed Emma 3 months ago, watching the teenager struggle with basic stance and grip. Something about the girl's determination had reminded Sarah of herself, leading her to offer some coaching tips that had quickly evolved into regular training sessions. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, and Sarah watched as 5 bikes pulled into the parking lot. The machines were expensive customs, chrome gleaming in the morning sun, but their rider's appearance set off immediate red flags in her mind. Their leather vests bore patches identifying them as the Desert Scorpions, a local gang she'd heard mentioned in hospital staff meetings, usually in connection with emergency room visits following bar fights. "Might want to keep an eye on this, Bob," Sarah said quietly, her nurse's instinct for trouble kicking in. "I've treated some of their handiwork in the ER." Bob nodded, his hand casually moving to rest near the phone. As a range safety officer, he had the authority to call the sheriff at the first sign of trouble, but experience had taught him to wait and observe. "They've got a right to shoot if they follow the rules," he replied, though his expression suggested he shared her concerns. Sarah watched through the window as the bikers dismounted, their body language radiating the kind of aggressive confidence she'd seen too often in the ER, usually right before security had to be called. The leader, a tall man with a shaved head and tribal tattoos covering his neck, was gesturing animatedly toward Emma's bay. The teenager had stopped her practice, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm heading out there," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used when calling orders in the trauma bay. "Better to welcome them properly before things get out of hand." Bob's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight nod of approval. They both knew that sometimes the best way to prevent trouble was to meet it head-on. As she stepped back into the morning sun, Sarah took a moment to center herself. Her mind flashed back to a forward operating base in Kandahar, where she'd once talked down an agitated soldier suffering from combat stress. The same principles applied here: project calm, maintain control, and be prepared for anything. The desert wind carried fragments of conversation from the bikers' direction. Their loud laughter and the way they were positioning themselves around Emma's bay reminded Sarah of predators circling prey. Her protective instincts, honed by years of defending vulnerable patients, began to surge. 20 years of nursing had taught her that bullies came in all forms. Sometimes they were diseases attacking a patient's body, sometimes they were administrators pushing staff too hard, and sometimes they were just people who confused intimidation with strength. But all bullies had one thing in common: they backed down when confronted with quiet, unshakable confidence. As Sarah walked toward Bay 3, her boots crunching softly on the gravel, she could feel the weight of her competition holster against her hip. She hadn't drawn it yet. There was usually a better way to handle conflict than immediately escalating to firearms. Still, 2 decades of competitive shooting meant she could transition from casual conversation to precise action faster than most people could blink. The morning was about to take an unexpected turn, and Sarah Connor was ready for whatever came next. What these bikers didn't realize was that they weren't just dealing with another range visitor. They were about to encounter someone who had kept her cool under actual enemy fire, who could outshoot most law enforcement officers, and who had spent her entire career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The desert sun climbed higher as Sarah approached the growing confrontation, each step measured and purposeful. Whatever happened next would depend entirely on the choices these bikers made. But one thing was certain: they had picked the wrong morning and the wrong range to cause trouble. The tension at Bay 3 was palpable as Sarah approached. Emma had backed away from her shooting position, her young face showing a mix of concern and defiance as the 5 bikers crowded her space. The gang's leader, who Sarah could now see had Razor tattooed across his knuckles, was picking up Emma's competition pistol from the shooting bench. "Sweet little gun for such a sweet little girl," Razor drawled, handling the weapon with exaggerated care. "Bet Daddy spent a lot of money on this setup." His gang members chuckled, spreading out in a practiced formation that Sarah recognized from her combat zone experiences. They were unconsciously establishing control of the area. "Please put that down," Emma said, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. "It's not safe to handle someone else's firearm without permission." The teenager's adherence to proper range safety protocols, even under pressure, made Sarah proud. Razor's face darkened at the correction. "Oh, we got ourselves a safety expert here, boys." He turned the pistol over in his hands, deliberately ignoring proper muzzle discipline. "Maybe you need some real men to teach you how to handle this thing properly." Sarah had seen enough. She closed the remaining distance with measured steps, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in the ICU during major traumas. "Good morning, gentlemen. I believe the young lady asked you to put her firearm down." All heads turned toward her. Sarah could read the quick dismissal in their eyes as they took in her small frame and professional appearance. It was a reaction she'd grown used to over the years, one that had worked to her advantage more times than she could count. A heavily bearded biker with mongoose patched on his vest snickered. "Well, look what we got here. The range safety ferry coming to check our permits?" The others joined in his laughter, but Sarah noticed their leader's eyes narrow slightly as he assessed her. "Sarah Connor," she introduced herself with a pleasant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Range safety instructor, medical professional, and Emma's shooting coach. And you're handling a custom race gun worth more than your bike." She nodded toward the pistol in Razor's hands. "I'd hate to see you drop it. The triggers on those are set pretty light." Razor's grip on the pistol tightened. "You threatening me, lady?" His voice carried the kind of artificial toughness Sarah had heard countless times in the ER, usually from patients trying to mask their pain or fear. "Not at all," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Just offering some technical advice. That's a competition-tuned M2011 with a 2-pound trigger. One slip and you could have a negligent discharge. As an ER nurse, I'd rather not spend my day off treating gunshot wounds." Her casual mention of treating gunshot wounds caused a subtle shift in the group's dynamics. The smallest biker, wearing a jacket with Twitch emblazoned across the back, took a half-step backward. Sarah noted the movement, just as she'd been trained to notice subtle changes in patient vital signs. "An ER nurse, huh?" Razor's tone was mocking, but there was something else in his voice now: uncertainty. "What's a healthcare hero doing out here playing with guns?" Sarah's smile widened slightly, showing a hint of teeth. "Same thing as everyone else, practicing. Though I started during my combat medicine deployments. Turns out treating casualties under enemy fire requires steady hands." She kept her tone conversational, but her eyes never left the pistol in Razor's hands. The mention of combat experience caused another shift in the group's stance. The bearded one, Mongoose, studied her more carefully now. "Combat medicine? Where at?" 3 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah replied. "Kandahar and Helmand province mostly. Taught combat medicine to medical personnel. You'd be surprised how many soldiers needed emergency care right on the firing line." She took a casual step closer to Emma, subtly positioning herself between the teenager and the bikers. A heavy-set biker with a skull tattooed on his bald head spoke up. "Ain't buying it. You're too small to be any kind of combat veteran." Sarah's laugh was genuine this time. Size matters less than skill, especially with firearms. But we're getting off track here. Her voice took on the firm tone she used with difficult patience. "Emma's bay time is scheduled until noon. There are 3 empty bays down the line if you gentlemen want to do some shooting of your own." Razor stepped closer, using his height to loom over her. The pistol in his hands was still pointed in an unsafe direction. "Maybe we like this bay. Maybe you and the little girl should find somewhere else to play." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped slightly, carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once helped her control chaos in a mortared field hospital. That would be unwise for several reasons. First, that unsafe weapon handling is a range violation. Second, harassment of other shooters is grounds for immediate removal. And third, she paused, letting her professional smile fade. "You really don't want to find out what happens next." The morning heat was building, and a desert hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the tension-filled air. Sarah could hear Bob moving in the range office behind them, likely already on the phone with the sheriff's department. But she kept her focus on Razor and the pistol in his hands, knowing the next few moments would determine whether this situation ended with words or something more serious. The bikers exchanged glances, reading the unexpected steel in this small woman's voice. What had started as simple intimidation of a teenage girl had evolved into something very different. They had come looking for easy entertainment, and instead found themselves facing someone who radiated the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from genuine experience in life and death situations. What happened next would depend entirely on their choice, but Sarah Connor was prepared either way. Sometimes the hardest part of being a nurse was knowing when to be gentle and when to be firm. This situation, she decided, definitely called for the latter. The tension in the desert air crackled like static before a storm. Razor's grip on Emma's competition pistol tightened, his knuckle tattoos whitening with pressure. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the scowl that twisted his features. "You know what I think?" he growled, taking another step toward Sarah. "I think you're full of it. Combat medicine? Competition shooting? Sounds like someone's been watching too many action movies." Sarah remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed but ready. Years of handling violent patients in the ER had taught her to read body language like vital signs. Right now, every signal from Razor screamed of wounded pride seeking an outlet. "Think what you want," she replied calmly. "But that weapon's still pointing in an unsafe direction, and you're still in a bay that's reserved for another shooter." Her eyes flicked momentarily to Emma, who had backed away but maintained her composure. The teenager's hand had moved to her phone, likely ready to call for help if needed. The bald biker with the skull tattoo, who the others called Tank, moved to flank Sarah's left side. "Maybe we should see some proof of these supposed skills," he sneered. "Put up or shut up, nurse." A small smile touched Sarah's lips. "Careful what you ask for. Proving my skills would mean embarrassing you in front of your friends." Her voice carried the same quiet confidence she used when telling families their loved ones would survive against the odds. Mongoose, the bearded biker, laughed harshly. "Big talk from a little lady. How about a friendly competition then? You outshoot Razor, we leave. You lose, this bay belongs to us." "And the girl's fancy gun too," Twitch added, earning a sharp nod of approval from Razor. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. In the distance, she could hear Bob Martinez talking on the phone, likely with the sheriff's department. She needed to handle this carefully, contain the situation without escalating it beyond control, just like managing a critical patient's deteriorating vital signs. "First," she said, her voice taking on the crisp tone she used in trauma situations, "you're going to put Emma's pistol down. Properly, action open, pointed downrange. Then we can discuss your challenge." Something in her tone made Razor hesitate. Perhaps it was the complete lack of fear, or maybe the way she took command of the situation so naturally. For a moment, the only sound was the soft desert breeze and the distant crack of rifles from the long-range area. "Fine," Razor finally said, carefully placing Emma's pistol on the shooting bench, though he did it correctly, evidence that he had at least some real firearms training. "Now about that challenge." "My gun, my rules," Sarah stated firmly. She reached into her range bag and withdrew her custom Glock 34, the one she'd used to win 3 state championships. The pistol was well worn but immaculately maintained, its modifications subtle but effective. Standard IPSC target at 25 yards. Best score out of 5 rounds wins. Razor's eyes narrowed as he studied her pistol. That's a competition gun. So is Emma's, which you were just handling, Sarah reminded him. But if you're worried about equipment advantages, I'm happy to use standard range rentals, though that might hurt your pride even more. Tank stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the shooting bench. Razor's the best shot in our club. He was Army, you know. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Which unit? 3rd Infantry Division, Razor replied, standing straighter. 2 tours in Iraq. Sarah nodded respectfully. Stolen valor wasn't part of his act, at least. Then you know how to handle yourself on a range, shall we? A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance. Word of the confrontation had spread to the other bays, and several regular shooters were watching with interest. Sarah spotted familiar faces among them: retired law enforcement, competitive shooters, veterans. She'd trained with many of them over the years. Razor seemed to notice the audience too. His options were limited now: back down and lose face in front of his gang, or accept the challenge from someone he'd underestimated badly. "Ladies first," he said with exaggerated politeness, gesturing to the firing line. Sarah shook her head. "Age before beauty. And since you're so concerned about fairness, you can use my gun first, I insist." The offer seemed generous, but it was tactical. She wanted him to shoot cold while she would benefit from watching his technique. As Razor stepped up to the line, Sarah gave Emma a reassuring nod. The teenager had moved to stand near Bob Martinez, who had emerged from the office to watch the proceedings. The old range officer's hand rested near his holstered sidearm, but his expression was almost amused. The morning heat was building, creating shimmer waves above the concrete range floor. Sarah watched as Razor checked her pistol with surprising confidence. His stance was textbook military, and his grip showed proper training. This wouldn't be a complete walkover, which would make the eventual lesson all the more effective. 5 rounds, best score wins, Sarah reminded him. Ready when you are. The desert held its breath as Razor raised the pistol. In the next few minutes, he was about to learn why the hospital staff called Sarah Deadeye Connor during tactical medical training sessions. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies was to let them choose their own humbling. Razor took his stance at the firing line, his military training evident in his proper form. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the growing crowd of spectators created a respectful semicircle behind the bay. Sarah watched his preparation with the same analytical eye she used when assessing patient symptoms in the ER. "Remember," she called out, 5 rounds, standard IPSC target. Take your time." Her voice carried the same encouraging tone she used with new nurses during their first trauma cases. Despite the situation, old teaching habits died hard. Razor's first shot cracked across the range, hitting the target just left of center. Not bad. Probably an 8 on the scoring rings. His next 3 shots grouped fairly well, showing his military training hadn't completely faded. The 5th shot, however, pulled right as his concentration wavered. "Not bad," Sarah commented professionally as they waited for the all clear to check targets. "Military qualification standards showing through. What was your last qual score?" "Expert," Razor replied automatically, then scowled as he realized she'd gotten him to respond like a soldier reporting to an officer. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, sensing their leader's irritation. When the range went cold, they walked downrange to check his target. The group of 5 shots formed a reasonable pattern, all within the scoring zones. Bob Martinez followed to verify the score, his experienced eye measuring the shot placement. 43 out of 50 possible, Bob announced. Respectable military-level shooting. His tone was neutral, but Sarah caught the slight emphasis on military level. They both knew the difference between qualification shooting and competitive accuracy. Razor turned to Sarah with a smirk. "Beat that, nurse." Sarah accepted her pistol back from him, checking it over with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved through the familiar motions while her mind settled into the focused state that had carried her through countless competitions and crisis situations. "Before I shoot," she said casually, ejecting the magazine and topping it off, Let's make this interesting. If I win, not only do you leave this range immediately, but you also apologize to Emma, and you never bother anyone here again. Tank stepped forward aggressively. And if Razor wins? Sarah's smile was cool and professional. He won't. But if he does, I'll not only give up the bay, I'll quit my coaching position here and admit I was wrong about everything I said. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm staking my reputation against your pride. Seems fair. A murmur went through the watching crowd. Several regular shooters exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen Sarah shoot before. Emma, still standing with Bob, was trying to hide a smile. Razor studied Sarah's face, looking for any sign of uncertainty. Finding none, his expression darkened. Deal. Show us what you got, nurse. Sarah stepped up to the firing line, her movements smooth and economical. The familiar weight of her competition Glock settled into her hands like an old friend. She took a deep breath, just as she did before starting difficult medical procedures. Ready, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent range. In the next few seconds, Sarah demonstrated why she'd won 3 state championships. Her first shot hole appeared dead center in the target's A zone, before the echo of the report had faded. The second followed so quickly it seemed like part of the same sound. 3, 4, and 5 came in a rhythm as natural as a heartbeat. The entire string of fire had taken less than 3 seconds. Dead silence fell over the range. Even the desert birds seemed to pause their morning songs. Sarah calmly engaged her safety and waited for the range officer's commands. Range is going cold, Bob announced, not quite hiding his satisfaction. Let's check those targets. As they walked downrange, the growing crowd of spectators stretched to see. Sarah's group of 5 shots had torn a single ragged hole in the center of the target, looking almost like one bullet impact. Bob pulled out his scoring overlay with unnecessary ceremony. 50 out of 50, he announced. Perfect score. A-zone group measuring less than an inch. He turned to address the bikers. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed what we call a clean run in competitive shooting. Razor stared at the target, his face a mix of disbelief and dawning realization. The other bikers had fallen completely silent, their earlier bravado evaporating in the desert heat. How? Twitch started to ask, but Tank elbowed him to silence. 20 years of competitive shooting, Sarah explained professionally, as if giving a medical lecture. Plus combat zone experience. You learn to stay calm under pressure when you're treating casualties while taking fire. She turned to face Razor directly. You're not a bad shot, military training shows. But there's a difference between qualification scores and competition accuracy. Just like there's a difference between being tough and being a bully. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting harsh light on the scene. Several of the regular shooters had drawn closer, their presence a subtle reminder that Sarah wasn't alone. Bob Martinez stood with his arms crossed, his expression making it clear it was time for the bikers to make good on their deal. Razor looked at his gang members, then back at the target with its single ragged hole. Sometimes lessons came from unexpected teachers, and this one had been particularly clear. His next words would determine whether he could salvage any dignity from the situation. A deal's a deal, he finally said, his voice rough but controlled. He turned to Emma, who watched with quiet satisfaction. I apologize for the trouble, miss. Won't happen again. Sarah nodded approvingly. Good choice. The range has excellent training programs if you're interested in improving your skills. All are welcome here, as long as they follow the rules and respect others. The message was clear. This could be either an ending or a beginning, depending on their choice. The desert wind picked up, carrying away the last traces of gunsmoke as the desert scorpions faced their moment of decision. The tension that had filled the desert air began to dissipate like morning mist under the Arizona sun. Razor's acknowledgement of defeat and subsequent apology had shifted the atmosphere at Bay 3 from hostile to something approaching respectful. The other bikers stood awkwardly, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertain glances between their leader and the small nurse, who had just demonstrated such extraordinary skill. That's some shooting, Mongoose said, breaking the silence. His tone carried genuine admiration. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Sarah safed her pistol and holstered it with practiced efficiency before responding. Started at this very range, actually. Bob here was my first instructor. She nodded toward the range officer. After my first deployment as a combat nurse, I needed something a way to process what I'd seen. Shooting gave me that focus. Tank, who had been studying the target with a professional's eye, spoke up. Those groups are tighter than our old unit instructors. He turned to Razor. Remember Sergeant Peterson? Guy used to brag about being the best shot in the division? A ghost of a smile crossed Razor's face. Yeah, bet he couldn't shoot like this either. He seemed to be wrestling with something internally before adding, "Ma'am, Ms. Connor, any chance you'd be willing to share some pointers? Been trying to get my qualification scores back up since leaving service." The request surprised everyone, especially his fellow gang members. Sarah assessed him carefully, using the same instincts that helped her determine which ER patients were truly ready to accept help. "Tell you what," she replied, maintaining her professional demeanor. "The range runs a veterans shooting clinic every Thursday evening. Focus on practical marksmanship and stress management. No charge for vets." She paused meaningfully. "All we ask is that participants check their egos and attitudes at the door." Bob Martinez stepped forward, adding his authority to the invitation. "Sarah's being modest. She helps run that clinic along with several other combat vets. Some of the best instruction you'll find anywhere if you're serious about improving." Emma, who had remained quiet during the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "She's an amazing teacher. 3 months ago, I could barely hit the broadside of a barn. Now I'm qualifying for junior competitions." Sarah felt a surge of pride at her students' words. The teenager's confidence had grown remarkably since they'd started working together, both on and off the range. Razor looked at his gang members, then back at Sarah. The decision he was weighing was about more than just shooting lessons. It was about choosing a different path. "Thursday evenings, you said?" 1800 hours, Sarah confirmed, deliberately using military time. "Bring your own weapon if you have one, or the range can provide. And leave the patches at home. On the range, we're all just shooters working to improve." The morning had grown warmer, and more regular range members were arriving for their weekend practice. Many nodded respectfully to Sarah as they passed, having witnessed the confrontation and its resolution. The Desert Scorpion's reputation would carry a different kind of story after today. "Come on, boys," Razor finally said to his gang. "Think we've taken up enough of everyone's time." He turned to Emma one last time. "Sorry again about handling your weapon without permission. Won't happen again." As the bikers began moving toward their motorcycles, Tank lingered behind. "You served in Kandahar?" he asked Sarah quietly. When she nodded, he continued, "Lost my brother there. Combat medic. He used to say the nurses in the field hospitals were the real heroes." Sarah's expression softened. "We all did our part. That's what Thursday nights are really about, remembering we're not alone with our memories." She handed him a range business card with the clinic details. "Share it with your friends if you think they'd benefit." The sound of motorcycles starting up filled the desert air, but this time it carried none of the menace from earlier. As the Desert Scorpions rode away, their chrome glinting in the morning sun, Bob Martinez approached Sarah with a knowing smile. "Turning potential troublemakers into students," he chuckled. "You've come a long way from that nervous nurse who showed up here 10 years ago looking for a way to steady her hands after her first tour." Sarah watched the dust settle on the access road. "Sometimes people just need a chance to be better than they think they are. Learned that in nursing before I ever picked up a competition pistol." She turned to Emma, who was reclaiming her shooting position. "Ready to get back to practice?" The teenager grinned. "After that display? More ready than ever. Think you could teach me that rapid-fire sequence?" "One step at a time," Sarah laughed. "Fundamentals first, just like in the ER. You don't run before you can walk, and you don't speed shoot before you can group consistently." As she began working with Emma on her stance and grip, Sarah reflected on how the morning had unfolded. What could have become a dangerous confrontation had instead turned into a potential opportunity for change. She'd seen it before in the ER. Sometimes the most aggressive patients became the most grateful, once they understood you were truly there to help. The desert sun climbed higher, promising another scorching Arizona day. But here on the range, under the shared discipline of marksmanship, barriers were breaking down and new connections were forming. Sarah Connor had come here this morning expecting just another practice session. Instead, she'd found another chance to heal, not with bandages and medications this time, but with skill, respect, and an opportunity for redemption. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Desert Valley Shooting Range, and the crisp February morning had given way to the scorching heat of an Arizona May. Sarah Connor pulled into the parking lot for the Thursday evening Veterans Clinic, noticing how much busier it had become since that fateful weekend. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples as she parked her Honda next to a row of motorcycles. She smiled at the sight. Not all of them belonged to the Desert Scorpions, but enough did to mark a significant change. Word had spread through the local veteran community about a nurse who could outshoot most military instructors, and about a range that offered more than just target practice. As Sarah gathered her range bag from the trunk, she heard the familiar voice of Razor calling out a greeting. The change in him over the past months had been remarkable. Gone was the aggressive gang leader. In his place stood a focused shooter who had traded his leather vest for a range safety officer vest. "Evening, Ms. Connor," he said, approaching with a stack of target frames. "We've got a full house tonight. 3 new vets from the VA showed up early looking pretty nervous. Figured you might want to handle their orientation." Sarah nodded, recognizing the unspoken message. She'd seen that nervous look before, the same one she'd had after her first deployment, the same one Razor himself had tried to hide behind bravado 3 months ago. "Thanks for the heads up. They come in together?" "Yeah. Afghanistan vets. One's a former combat medic." Razor's voice carried understanding. "Tank's talking to them now, sharing his brother's story. Thought it might help them feel more comfortable." The transformation in the Desert Scorpions had been gradual, but profound. After that first Thursday session where Razor had shown up alone and uncertain, others had followed. Tank had become a regular, often helping new veterans feel welcome. Even Mongoose had traded his troublemaking for a newfound passion for long-range precision shooting. Sarah made her way to the classroom area where the new veterans waited. Through the window, she could see Tank gesturing animatedly as he talked with 3 young men who carried themselves with the subtle tension she recognized from her deployment days. The youngest looked barely old of his 20s, with a haunted look she'd seen too often in her ICU. "Sarah!" Emma's voice called out from the range. The teenager had blossomed over the past months, not just in her shooting skills, but in her confidence. She was now helping with basic firearms classes, her own experience with the Desert Scorpions making her particularly good at helping nervous newcomers feel at ease. "Hey Emma, how's the new competition pistol working out?" Sarah asked, noting the shining metal hanging around her student's neck. "First place in juniors last weekend," Emma beamed. "And guess who showed up to cheer me on? The whole Desert Scorpions Club. They were better behaved than some of the competition parents." Sarah laughed, remembering how Twitch had actually told off another spectator for disrupting Emma's concentration during the final stage. The same man who had once tried to intimidate the teenager had become one of her most vocal supporters. Bob Martinez emerged from the range office, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Some reporter from the local paper called again," he reported. "Wants to do a story on how a nurse and a bunch of bikers turned a shooting range into some kind of veterans rehabilitation program." "Tell them what you always do," Sarah replied, checking her watch. "We're not doing anything special, just providing a safe place for people to heal in their own way." The evening class would start soon. Sarah could see more vehicles pulling into the parking lot, a mix of cars, trucks, and motorcycles. The Thursday night sessions had grown beyond just shooting instruction. They had become a place where veterans could find understanding without judgment, skill building without pressure, and community without conditions. "Got something to show you," Razor said, returning from setting up the targets. He pulled out his phone, displaying a photo of a wall plaque. VA Clinic finally got their approval. Starting next month, they're officially recognizing range time as part of their PTSD therapy program. They want you to consult on the protocol. Sarah absorbed this news, thinking of all the veterans she'd treated in the ER who might have benefited from finding this kind of outlet sooner. "We'll need more instructors," she mused, "and to coordinate with their medical staff." "Already handled," Bob interrupted with a grin. "Tank's halfway through his range officer certification, Mongoose too. Even got Twitch learning basic firearms instruction." He nodded toward the parking lot. "And it looks like your newest student has arrived." A familiar red Jeep Wrangler pulled in. Dr. Martinez, no relation to Bob, the head of psychiatric services at the VA. She had visited the range 2 weeks ago to observe the program and had immediately signed up for private lessons with Sarah. Who would have thought, Razor reflected, watching the varied group of people gathering for the evening session, that getting humbled by a nurse would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to us. Sarah checked her competition pistol one last time, preparing for the evening's instruction. "Sometimes the best medicine isn't found in a hospital," she replied. "Sometimes it's found in unexpected places, with unexpected people, doing unexpected things." The desert sunset painted long shadows across the range as Sarah moved to greet the new veterans. Behind her, Emma was showing Tank her competition medal. Bob was reviewing safety protocols with Mongoose, and Dr. Martinez was deep in conversation with Twitch about the therapeutic benefits of focused practice. What had started as a confrontation had evolved into something far more powerful, a community where healing happened one trigger press at a time, where past mistakes gave way to future potential, and where the precise disciplines of marksmanship provided a path to peace for troubled spirits. The summer heat shimmered above the Arizona pavement as Sarah pulled into Phoenix General's parking lot for her evening shift in the ER. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Desert Valley Range, and the ripple effects continued to spread in unexpected ways. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tank. "2 new vets in the ER, one's pretty worked up. Remember that Marine from last week?" Sarah smiled, appreciating how their informal network had grown. Tank now worked as a peer counselor at the VA, and he'd developed a knack for identifying veterans in crisis who might benefit from their range program. The emergency room was typically busy for a Friday night. As Sarah changed into her scrubs, she could hear the familiar controlled chaos that defined her professional world. The head nurse, Maria, caught her eye as she emerged from the locker room. "Your biker friends are back," Maria said with a knowing smile. "They've got the waiting room under control better than security. Even got Mr. Jenkins to take his meds without arguing. Something about sharing war stories from Desert Storm." Sarah glanced out to see Mongoose and Twitch in their newly minted peer counselor vests, chatting quietly with various patients. The Desert Scorpions had found a new calling, volunteering at the hospital during peak hours. Their presence, once a source of tension, now brought a unique kind of comfort to the volatile ER environment. "Sarah!" a familiar voice called out. Dr. Richardson, the ER's chief of psychiatry, waved her over. "Got a minute? Need to discuss the preliminary results of our range therapy program." They stepped into a quiet consultation room where Dr. Richardson pulled up a spreadsheet on his tablet. "The numbers are remarkable," he said, enthusiasm clear in his voice. Veterans who participated in the range program showed a 60% reduction in ER visits for anxiety-related issues. PTSD symptom scores dropped by an average of 40% after 3 months of regular attendance. Sarah thought about the faces behind those numbers. The combat medic who'd found peace in precision rifle shooting. The helicopter pilot who'd stopped having nightmares after joining their long-range classes. The young Army nurse whose hands had steadied both on and off the range. "There's more, Doctor," Richardson continued. "The VA is looking to implement similar programs at ranges across the state. They want you and your team to develop the training protocol. Especially interested in how you've integrated the peer support component." A commotion from the ER interrupted their conversation. Sarah hurried out to find Razor, now officially James Rodriguez, range safety officer and peer counselor, talking down an agitated young man in Marine Corps combat boots. "I get it, brother," Razor was saying, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd learned over the past months. "Kandahar, 2019. I was there too. Different unit, same shit. Let the doctors check you out, then maybe we talk about a better way to handle those memories." The Marine's stance slowly relaxed as Razor spoke. Sarah noticed he was using the same calm, measured tone she'd taught him for range instruction. The skills that made a good shooting coach, it turned out, translated well to crisis intervention. Emma, who had started volunteering at the hospital while pursuing her pre-med studies, appeared with a clipboard. "Mr. Rodriguez, that veteran support group you mentioned is meeting tomorrow at the range. I've got the details here if you're interested, sir," she addressed the Marine with professional courtesy. Sarah watched the scene unfold with pride. Emma had grown from a nervous teenager into a confident young woman, her experience with the Desert Scorpions giving her a unique ability to bridge the gap between medical staff and troubled veterans. "Connor!" Bob Martinez's voice came from behind her. The old range officer had taken to visiting the ER regularly, officially to coordinate the therapy program, but Sarah suspected he simply enjoyed seeing their work's broader impact. "Got those new range protocols approved by the medical board. They want us to start training other ranges next month." The news brought both excitement and challenge. What had started as a simple shooting clinic had evolved into something far more significant. Other hospitals were taking notice, asking how a nurse and a reformed biker gang had created one of the most effective veteran support programs in the state. "You know what this means?" Tank said, joining them after finishing with another veteran. "We're gonna need more instructors, more peer counselors too." "Already handled," Razor interjected, having successfully calmed the Marine. "Remember those 3 guys from the VA last week? All signed up for range officer certification. And get this, the Marine Corps base down south wants to send some of their combat stress teams to observe our program." Sarah found herself surrounded by the unlikely family they'd built. Former troublemakers turned healers, veterans helping veterans, medical professionals and range officers working together to create something unique. The Desert Scorpions patches now carried a new symbol below their original logo, a medical caduceus crossed with a precision rifle. "You know," Bob mused, watching Mongoose help an elderly veteran into a wheelchair, "when you outshot Razor that morning, I thought we were just avoiding trouble. Never imagined we'd end up creating all this." Sarah checked her watch. Almost time for her shift to start. The ER was filling up with the usual Friday night cases, but now they had a new resource for the veterans who came through their doors. A way to offer not just medical treatment, but a path forward. "Sometimes," she replied, preparing to start her rounds. "The best medicine comes from the most unexpected prescriptions. We just had to find the right dose of discipline, community, and purpose." The desert night was falling outside the hospital windows as Sarah began her shift, knowing that across town at Desert Valley Range, another group of veterans was finding their way back to peace, one careful shot at a time. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, Sarah Connor stood at the podium of the National Veterans Health Conference in Washington, D.C. The enormous conference hall was packed with medical professionals, military personnel, and veteran support organizations, all eager to learn about the program that had become known as the Arizona Model. Behind her on stage sat an unlikely panel of experts. Razor, now clean-cut in a professional suit, Tank in his VA counselor's blazer, and Dr. Richardson from Phoenix General. Even Bob Martinez had made the trip, though he looked uncomfortable in formal attire rather than his usual range officer's vest. "It started with a simple truth," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had faced down the Desert Scorpions a year ago. "Sometimes healing doesn't happen in hospitals. Sometimes it happens in unexpected places with unexpected people through unexpected means." The presentation screen showed photos of Desert Valley Range, veterans working with instructors, peer counseling sessions between shooting relays, medical professionals integrating range time with traditional therapy. But it was the statistics that caught everyone's attention. A 70% reduction in veteran suicide attempts among program participants, a 65% decrease in PTSD-related hospitalizations, and an 80% success rate in helping veterans transition back to civilian employment. The key wasn't just the shooting, Tank explained during the Q&A session. It was building a community where veterans could feel in control again, where the discipline of marksmanship gave them a focus for their hypervigilance, and where peer support came from people who truly understood their experiences. A general from the Pentagon raised his hand. "Ms. Connor, your program has shown remarkable results, but there must have been challenges. How did you overcome initial skepticism from the medical community?" Sarah smiled, remembering the early days. "By letting the results speak for themselves. When ER visits dropped and patient outcomes improved, even the strongest skeptics had to take notice. But more importantly, we made sure to maintain rigorous medical oversight while creating an environment where veterans felt understood rather than just treated." The questions continued for hours. How did they screen instructors? What safety protocols were in place? How did they integrate traditional therapy with range activities? Sarah and her team answered each one, drawing from their year of experience building something that had never been tried before. During a break, Razor approached the microphone to share his perspective. "A year ago, I was part of the problem," he admitted. "My gang and I thought we were tough guys, throwing our weight around at a local range. Then we met Nurse Connor here." He paused, allowing a knowing chuckle to ripple through the audience. "She didn't just outshoot us. She showed us a better way to use our experiences, our understanding of veteran issues. Now, instead of causing trouble, we're helping other vets find their way back." The afternoon session focused on expansion plans. 10 other states had already requested help setting up similar programs. The VA was creating a new classification for therapeutic marksmanship facilities. Even the Department of Defense had expressed interest in implementing preventive programs for active duty personnel. Emma, who had flown in specially for the conference, presented research she'd been conducting for her pre-med program. "We're seeing neurological changes in participants," she explained with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. "The combination of focused marksmanship training and peer support appears to help rewire trauma responses. It's not just psychological, we're seeing physical changes in how the brain processes stress." As the conference drew to a close, Sarah found herself surrounded by military medical officers, VA administrators, and veteran advocacy groups, all eager to learn more. But her attention was drawn to a quiet figure standing at the back of the hall, a young woman in Marine Corps dress blues, watching intently. During the reception that followed, the Marine approached her. "Lieutenant Sarah Martinez," she introduced herself. "Combat Stress Team Leader at Quantico. That Marine you helped in the ER 6 months ago? That was my brother. He's doing better now thanks to your program." Sarah remembered that night clearly. The agitated young Marine, Razor's intervention, the first step toward healing. "How is he?" "Completing his peer counselor certification next week," Lieutenant Martinez replied with a smile. "But I'm here officially. The Marine Corps wants to integrate your methods into our combat stress prevention programs. We think it could help prevent PTSD before veterans ever leave service." The implications were enormous. What had started as a confrontation at a local range could potentially help transform military mental health care. Sarah looked around the reception hall, at Razor discussing peer counseling techniques with VA officials, at Tank sharing program statistics with medical researchers, at Emma explaining neurological findings to a group of psychiatrists. Bob Martinez appeared at her elbow, still tugging uncomfortably at his tie. "Pretty far from that morning at the range, huh?" he said quietly. "Never would have guessed that teaching you to shoot all those years ago would lead to all this." Sarah watched as a group of VA administrators clustered around Mongoose, who was explaining how they'd adapted range safety protocols for veterans with varying levels of trauma response. The former troublemaker now spoke with the authority of someone who had found his true purpose. "You know what the best part is?" she replied. "Every time we help one veteran, they go on to help others. It's like ripples in a pond, spreading out further than we can see." The Washington evening was visible through the conference center windows, the Capitol dome lit up against the darkening sky. Inside, the future of veteran mental health care was being reshaped by an unlikely alliance of medical professionals, reformed bikers, and dedicated range officers. The confrontation that had started it all seemed both long ago and just yesterday. Sarah touched the small caduceus pendant she still wore, a reminder that healing could take many forms, and that sometimes the best medicine came from the heart of those who had once needed healing themselves. 18 months after that fateful February morning, Desert Valley Range had transformed beyond recognition. Sarah Connor pulled into the expanded parking lot, now filled with a mix of vehicles that told the story of how far they'd come. Everything from Razor's pristine new truck, complete with Veterans Support Team decals, to military vehicles from the nearby base, and even a few ambulances converted into mobile counseling units. The Arizona sun was just beginning to rise, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. Sarah sat in her car for a moment, taking in the sight of what their small community had built. The range had grown to include a full medical clinic, counseling center, and what they now called the integration zone, a space where veterans could transition between traditional therapy and range activities. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Big day. Just got my acceptance letter to med school. Guess who wrote my recommendation? Dr. Richardson says my research on the program helped seal the deal." Sarah smiled, remembering the nervous teenager who had stood her ground against the desert scorpions. Now Emma was preparing to become a doctor, her experience at the range shaping her vision of how medicine could be practiced differently. As she stepped out of her car, Sarah heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. But these days, that sound brought comfort rather than concern. The Desert Scorpions, now officially renamed as the Desert Guardian Support Team, had become an integral part of their veteran outreach program. Their leather vests now bore patches identifying them as certified peer counselors and range safety officers. "Morning, Sarah," Razor called out, parking his bike. He was dressed in the program's official uniform, a polo shirt with their new logo, a combination of crossed rifles and the medical caduceus. "Got 3 new vets coming in from the VA today. Tank's already briefing them in the Welcome Center." The Welcome Center had once been Bob Martinez's simple range office. Now it was a state-of-the-art facility where new participants could be evaluated and integrated into the program. Bob himself had finally semi-retired, though he still showed up most mornings to share coffee and wisdom with the staff. "You're here early," Sarah noted, falling into step beside Razor as they walked toward the main building. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Keep thinking about that Marine from last week. Reminded me of myself before that morning you showed us a better way." He paused, looking out over the range where the first rays of sunlight were touching the targets. "Never thought I'd say this, but getting humbled by a nurse was the best thing that ever happened to me." Inside the facility, the morning shift was getting underway. Mongoose was conducting a safety briefing for new participants, his former aggressive demeanor replaced by calm professionalism. Tank worked with a group of veterans in the meditation room they'd added between the clinic and the range, a space designed to help participants center themselves before and after shooting sessions. Dr. Richardson emerged from his office waving a stack of papers. "Sarah, just got the latest data from the national study. Our model's being implemented at 30 ranges across the country now. Success rates are even higher than we projected." The sound of precision rifle fire echoed from the long-range area, where Twitch was working with a group of veterans on advanced marksmanship techniques. The focused discipline required for long-range shooting had proven particularly effective for veterans dealing with anxiety and hypervigilance. "Ms. Connor?" A young Army medic approached, her hands trembling slightly. I heard about how this all started, about how you stood up to the bikers. I've been dealing with some stuff since my last deployment, and my counselor said this program might help." Sarah recognized the look in the medic's eyes, the same one she'd seen in her own reflection after her first combat zone deployment. "Come on," she said gently. "Let me show you how we do things here." As they walked toward the training bay, they passed the wall of photographs that documented their journey. There was the original confrontation, captured by one of the range cameras, the first veteran therapy group, the day they received official VA recognition, Emma's first shooting competition victory, the Desert Scorpions receiving their peer counselor certifications. The latest addition was a photo from the National Veterans Health Conference. Sarah and her unlikely team of reformed bikers, medical professionals, and dedicated veterans, all working together to reshape how PTSD and combat trauma were treated. You know what makes this program work? Sarah asked the young medic as they reached the training bay. It's not just about shooting. It's about finding your strength again in whatever form that takes. Sometimes it's about precision marksmanship. Sometimes it's about helping others. Sometimes it's just about being understood by people who've walked the same path. Bob Martinez appeared carrying his morning coffee. Telling the origin story again? He asked with a knowing smile. Remembering where we started helps us see how far we've come, Sarah replied, and reminds us why we do this. The facility was fully awake now, filled with the sounds of healing taking place in its many forms. The crack of well-aimed shots, the murmur of counseling sessions, the laughter of veterans finding their community again. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. As Sarah prepared to begin the medic's orientation, she caught sight of Razor leading a group therapy session, Tank coordinating with VA officials, and Emma giving a tour to medical students interested in their program. The desert morning had bloomed into full daylight, much like their small idea had grown into a movement. Ready to start? She asked the medic, who nodded nervously. Just one question, the young soldier said. How did you know? That morning with the bikers. How did you know it would work out like this? Sarah thought for a moment, touching the caduceus pendant she still wore. I didn't, she admitted. I just knew that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person standing up and showing a better way. Everything else? That came from all of us working together to help each other heal. The desert wind carried the sound of hope across the range. Hope that had started with a confrontation, grown through understanding, and blossomed into a new way of healing. The story of the nurse who had outshot the bikers had become legend, but the real story was what had grown from that moment. A community where healing happened one shot, one conversation, and one veteran at a time.